The alarm clock that shouldn't have rung. I'll never forget the sound. Sharp, metallic, almost alive. It was my old alarm clock. One of those analog ones with the twin bells on top and the little hammer that bangs between them like it's trying to punch a hole through time. I hadn't seen it in years, left it buried in a box somewhere when I moved into this apartment. So, when I woke up to that awful ringing at 6:15 a.m. on a Monday morning, I felt more confused than anything. My phone was my alarm now, and I'd never unpacked that ancient thing. Bleary-eyed, I smacked it quiet and stared at it sitting there on my nightstand like it had always been there. For a minute, I thought I was dreaming. The face of the clock was scratched, the little hand slightly bent, exactly as I remembered. But this was wrong. I distinctly remembered leaving it in storage. After a few moments of trying to logic my way out of the weirdness, I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd unpacked it without thinking, or my memory was playing tricks on me. I shoved it in the closet, buried under some sweaters, and went about my day. Work was uneventful, boring, if I'm honest. Just emails and spreadsheets, the kind of grind that makes the week feel endless. Afterward, I hit the gym, grabbed some Chinese takeout on the way home, and spent the evening half watching TV. By the time I went to bed, the clock was the last thing on my mind. But then it happened again. 6:15 a.m. The same sharp, relentless ringing. I sat bolt upright, heart pounding. It was back. The alarm clock. Sitting on my nightstand like I'd never moved it. I stared at it for a long time, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I knew I'd put it away. I remembered the feel of its cold, dented metal shell as I shoved it into the closet. I checked the closet, just to be sure. Empty. No clock. This wasn't sleepwalking or forgetfulness. Something was off. That day felt strange, like I was walking through fog. At work, I couldn't focus. Everything felt too familiar. Conversations with coworkers, the crappy office coffee, even the way my boss dropped a stack of papers on my desk and muttered, "Another one for the pile, Paul." I didn't realize it at the time, but it was the same. All of it. When I got home, I pulled the clock out from under my bed, don't ask me how it ended up there, and smashed it against the floor. The glass face shattered, and the little bells flew off like shrapnel. I swept up the pieces, tossed them in the trash, and went to bed feeling oddly triumphant. But then, 6:15 a.m., the alarm rang. The clock was back on my nightstand. Intact. Perfect. Like it had never been destroyed. My stomach turned. This wasn't just weird anymore. It was impossible. I stared at the clock for what felt like hours, the ticking growing louder in my ears. I wanted to throw it, burn it, smash it again, but I was too scared to touch it. The rest of the day played out exactly the same as the one before. Same work tasks, same conversations, same crappy coffee. I started testing it, saying different things to coworkers or skipping lunch, but nothing changed. By the time I went to bed, I was terrified. And when I woke up, 6:15 a.m., it was Monday again. By now, I was sure of it. I was stuck. I didn't know how or why, but I was trapped in some kind of loop. Every time I woke up, it was the same day, the same clock, the same relentless alarm. And the worst part? Each time I touched the clock, it felt alive. By the fifth loop, I'd stopped pretending I could reason my way out of this. It wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't stress or overwork or some kind of brain glitch. This was real, and I was stuck in it. Monday had me in a chokehold. Same alarm, same clock, same damn day. But here's the thing about routines, even twisted ones. Eventually, you start noticing the cracks. That morning, I left the alarm clock on the nightstand, refusing to touch it. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to keep my breathing steady. The apartment felt too quiet, like the air itself was waiting for me to screw up. I needed out. I threw on some clothes and bolted out the door, skipping breakfast, skipping everything. The city outside was the same too. Cars honking, people rushing to work. But something about it felt off. There was a woman on the corner near my building, dressed in a bright red coat. I noticed her because she was just standing there, staring at me. No phone, no coffee, no nothing. Just watching. Her face didn't look angry or curious. It was blank, like she was waiting for me to do something. I turned away and kept walking. At work, the cracks were even more obvious. My boss made the same comment, "Another one for the pile, Paul." But this time, his voice had a strange edge to it, like a recording played a few too many times, with a faint distortion beneath the words. I tested it by spilling my coffee all over my desk. My boss just stared at me, unblinking, and then, without looking, handed me a napkin. It wasn't just that he didn't seem surprised. It was that he couldn't seem surprised, like he didn't know how. By the end of the day, I felt like I was losing my grip. On my way home, I passed the woman in the red coat again. Same corner, same blank stare. This time, I stopped. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even blink. I backed away and hurried home, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I got to my apartment, the door was ajar. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. Instead, I pushed the door open slowly, bracing myself for, what? A burglar? A murderer? But the apartment was empty, except for the alarm clock. It wasn't on the nightstand anymore. It was on the kitchen counter, ticking softly. I knew I hadn't moved it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the clock, daring it to make the first move. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, that familiar ringing was slicing through my brain. 6:15 a.m. The clock was back on the nightstand, as if nothing had happened. But this time, there was something else. Scratched into the wood beneath the clock were two words. "Wake up." When I saw those words, "wake up," scratched into my nightstand, my breath caught. The carving was rough, jagged, like it had been done in a hurry. I ran my fingers over the grooves, trying to convince myself it wasn't there. But it was real, just like the clock, just like the loop. Someone, or something, wanted me to see it. I tried to shake it off and go through the motions of the day, but it was impossible now. My mind raced with questions. What did wake up mean? Wake up from what? Was this a coma? A simulation? Some kind of punishment? I couldn't focus. My coworkers didn't seem to notice. Hell, they barely even acted human anymore. The boss's distorted tone, the same rehearsed lines from the guy in IT, the receptionist's weirdly perfect smile. They were like mannequins stuck in a script. But the woman in the red coat? She wasn't like the others. I saw her again that morning, standing at the same corner, watching me with that blank expression. This time, I didn't ignore her. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. Her head tilted slightly, just enough to make me uncomfortable. For the first time, her lips moved. "Do you hear it yet?" she asked, her voice low and distant, like it came from the bottom of a well. "Hear what?" I snapped. "What the hell is going on?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes locked on mine. "Stop running," she said. "It's watching." Before I could respond, she turned and walked into the crowd, disappearing as if she'd never been there. Her words echoed in my head all day. "Stop running. It's watching." Was she talking about the clock? I tried to avoid it when I got home, but it was impossible. The damn thing seemed to follow me. I'd left it on the nightstand that morning, but now it was sitting on the kitchen table, ticking softly. I stared at it for a long time, a creeping dread settling over me. It was just a clock, but it felt alive. When I finally worked up the courage to touch it, I noticed something new. There was another message, this time etched into the back panel. "Find the cracks." That night, I decided to test the loop. If I couldn't break out of it, maybe I could break into it. Find the seams, the flaws, whatever the hell it meant by cracks. I started small. On my walk to work, I knocked over a garbage can. Nobody reacted. Not a single head turned. In the office, I pushed things further. I unplugged my boss's computer mid-sentence during one of his canned rants. He just stared at me for a moment, then continued talking like nothing had happened. The final test was drastic. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the hallway and smashed it against the office window. The glass didn't break. It didn't even crack. Instead, it rippled, like the surface of a pond. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. Whatever this was, it wasn't real. On my way home, I saw her again, the woman in red. This time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, just barely visible in the crowd, was a tall, shadowy figure. It stood unnaturally still, its face obscured by a haze that seemed to bend the light around it. She raised a hand and pointed at me, her blank stare turning into something almost angry. "You're running out of time," she said. "Find the cracks, or it'll find you." Before I could say anything, she and the shadow vanished into the crowd. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The clock was waiting for me on the coffee table, ticking louder than ever. And as I stared at it, I started to hear something beneath the ticking, a faint whisper. The whisper wasn't coming from outside the clock. It was coming through it. It started faint, just beneath the steady tick-tick-tick. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a side effect of staring at the damn thing too long. But as I leaned closer, I realized it was real. The voice was faint, almost inaudible, like a static-laced radio transmission. It wasn't speaking words, not exactly, just a low, rhythmic murmur that sent shivers down my spine. I yanked my head back, heart pounding. My instinct screamed at me to throw the clock out the window, but I didn't. Because if the voice was real, maybe it was trying to tell me something, or warn me. I didn't touch the clock that night. I sat across the room from it, too scared to go near it, too curious to look away. Around 2 a.m., the whisper changed. It grew louder, clearer, until the words started forming. "Paul, you're not supposed to be here." I shot to my feet, nearly tripping over the coffee table. My name. It said my name. Before I could process what was happening, the clock started ticking faster. The hands spun wildly, blurring together into a silver streak. And then the whispers stopped. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in bed, gasping for air. 6:15 a.m. The alarm was louder than ever, screaming like it was trying to tear my eardrums apart. I slammed my hand on it, silencing it, and noticed something immediately. The clock was cracked. A jagged fracture ran across the glass face, splitting the numbers underneath. For the first time since the loop started, something had changed. I didn't go to work that day. Instead, I stayed in the apartment, studying the clock. I turned it over and over in my hands, inspecting every inch of it. The crack on the face wasn't the only one. The back panel, where "Find the cracks" had been etched, was now split slightly open. My hands trembled as I pried at the edges. Inside, there were no gears, no springs, nothing mechanical at all. Instead, there was a small black orb, smooth and cold like polished obsidian. It pulsed faintly, sending a wave of nausea through me every time it did. I didn't know what I was looking at, but every instinct I had screamed that it wasn't supposed to be here. The orb started vibrating, almost imperceptibly, and the whispers returned. "Stop running." This time, the voice was clearer, angrier. And then I heard something else. A sound from the hallway outside my apartment. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. I froze, clutching the clock. The footsteps stopped outside my door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a soft knock. 3 taps. Knock. 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 My stomach churned. No one visited me, especially not this late. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath. The knocking came again. Louder. Knock. 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 "Paul." The voice was deep and hollow, like it didn't belong to a person. I backed away from the door, clutching the clock like it was a shield. The knocking stopped. The silence was worse. I waited for what felt like hours, staring at the door, listening for any sign of movement. Finally, I crept forward and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but as I turned away, something caught my eye. Scratched into the door, in jagged, frantic lines, was a single word. "Listen." I stared at the word "listen" carved into the door for what felt like an eternity. The jagged letters seemed alive, almost twitching in the dim hallway light. My palms were slick with sweat, the weight of the clock heavy in my hand. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to know what had knocked, or what had spoken my name. But I also knew I couldn't ignore it forever. When I finally stepped into the hallway, it was empty. The air was still and heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. There was no sign of whoever, or whatever, had been outside. Just the word "listen" burned into the door like a warning. I turned to go back inside, but something stopped me. At the far end of the hallway, near the stairwell, I saw a shadow. It wasn't moving. It wasn't connected to anything. It just hung there, dark and jagged against the wall, despite the fluorescent lights above. I don't know why, but I walked toward it. As I got closer, the whispering started again. It wasn't coming from the clock this time. It was coming from the shadow. The words were fragmented, broken up like a bad signal. "Stop running, wake up, it's..." The closer I got, the colder the air became. My breath puffed out in small, white clouds, and my skin prickled like 1,000 needles were pressing into it. When I was only a few feet away, the shadow moved. It stretched along the wall, shifting and writhing like it was alive. And then, slowly, it peeled away. It didn't make sense. Shadows don't move on their own, let alone detach from surfaces. But this one did. It unfurled, rising into the shape of something humanoid. No face, no features, just a tall, dark figure that seemed to suck the light out of the hallway. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the clock. "Paul," it said. Its voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls, the floor, and my chest. "Why are you here?" I couldn't answer. My throat was dry, and my body felt frozen, like the figure's presence had locked me in place. "Find the cracks," it said, leaning closer, "or it will find you." Before I could ask what it meant, the shadow collapsed in on itself, shrinking down into a pool of darkness on the floor. And then it was gone. I stumbled back into my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, and my hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the clock. The whispering started again as soon as I set it down. This time, the words were clearer. "Find the cracks before it's too late." I didn't know who or what was speaking to me, but I was done waiting for answers to come to me. The clock, the messages, the shadow, the loop, they were all connected somehow. If I wanted out of this nightmare, I had to follow the clues. I started tearing the apartment apart, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Every drawer, every cabinet, every inch of wall and floor. It wasn't until I reached the bathroom mirror that I found something. There was a faint outline of a door in the glass. Not a reflection, but an actual outline, glowing faintly behind the surface. I touched it, and the glass rippled under my fingers. The whispering grew louder. "Find the cracks." I didn't want to go through. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stop, to turn back, to wake up. But I didn't have a choice. Taking a deep breath, I pushed my hand into the mirror. The glass parted like water, cold and sticky against my skin. As I stepped through, the last thing I heard was the alarm clock ringing. 6:15 a.m. And then I was gone. The moment I stepped through the mirror, the world changed. The cold, sticky sensation on my skin gave way to a suffocating pressure, like I was being squeezed through a tube. My ears popped, and a low, thrumming sound filled my head, drowning out my own thoughts. When I emerged on the other side, I stumbled forward, gasping for air. It was dark. Not just the absence of light, this was a void. A blackness so complete it felt like the air itself was made of shadow. I turned, expecting to see the mirror behind me, but there was nothing, just more darkness. And then the whispering began again. The whispers came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing around me in a language I couldn't understand. It wasn't the same voice as before. This one was fractured, overlapping, like 100 people trying to talk over each other. I tried to move, but the ground beneath my feet was slick and unsteady, like walking on wet glass. Every step echoed endlessly, the sound swallowed by the void. I wasn't alone here. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. A presence watching me, studying me. The air grew heavier, colder, pressing down on my chest. I gripped the alarm clock tighter, its weight oddly comforting. "Where am I?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. A voice answered, not a whisper this time. a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the darkness. "You don't belong." The words hit me like a physical force, making me stumble. "I'm trying to get out," I shouted back. "I didn't ask for this." The growl turned into a low chuckle, a sound that made my skin crawl. "You think this is about you," the voice said. Before I could respond, the ground beneath me shifted. The slick surface tilted violently, and I slid forward, unable to find my footing. I tumbled into the darkness, the air whipping past me as I fell. For what felt like hours, I was weightless, spinning through the void. The whispers returned, louder now, their fractured voices overlapping in a maddening symphony. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the fall stopped. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the void. I was standing in my apartment. At least, it looked like my apartment. The furniture was the same, the walls the same, but everything was wrong. The colors were muted, like I was looking at a faded photograph. The air was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. And the clock? Oh God, the clock. It was everywhere. Dozens of identical alarm clocks lined every surface, their faces all cracked, their hands spinning wildly. The ticking was deafening, a chaotic rhythm that made my head throb. I reached for the nearest clock, desperate to silence it, but as soon as I touched it, the whispering returned. This time, the words were clear. "Find the source, or be consumed." I backed away, my heart pounding. The clocks were watching me. I don't know how I knew, but I could feel their gaze, their malice. The air shifted, and I felt the presence again. The same one from the void. It was here with me, and it wasn't alone. In the corner of the room, the shadows began to gather, pooling into a shape that was all too familiar. The tall, faceless figure from the hallway emerged, its form twisting unnaturally as it stepped closer. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures took shape, each one darker and more distorted than the last. The whispering rose to a deafening roar, and the words carved into my door came rushing back to me. "Listen." I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the noise, the shadows, the ticking. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. The answer came from everywhere at once, a cacophony of voices speaking as one. "The clock is not your enemy. The enemy is waking." The words reverberated through my skull. "The clock is not your enemy. The enemy is waking." I opened my eyes, but I almost wished I hadn't. The shadow figures had grown taller, their forms writhing like smoke trapped in glass. Their eyeless faces stared at me, unmoving, but I could feel their focus. The room seemed to shrink around me, the air tightening like a noose. I clutched the alarm clock to my chest like a lifeline, its ticking pounding against my ribs. "What does that mean?" I shouted. "What enemy? What's waking?" The shadows didn't answer, but the clocks did. All around me, the dozens of clocks chimed at once, their cracked faces glowing with a sickly yellow light. The sound wasn't like any alarm I'd ever heard, shrill, piercing, like metal tearing through bone. I dropped to my knees, covering my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me, vibrating through my teeth and rattling my thoughts. Through the noise, a single voice broke through, clearer than ever. "Find the source. Find the source. Find the source." I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling. The shadows were closing in, their forms blurring together into a black tide that consumed the edges of the room. I had to move. Gripping the clock tightly, I ran for the door. It didn't lead to my hallway. Instead, I stumbled into a narrow corridor that stretched endlessly in both directions. The walls were covered in more clocks, their faces cracked and spinning just like the ones in my apartment. The ticking was relentless, overlapping into a chaotic storm of sound. Behind me, the shadows followed, creeping along the walls like ink spilled in water. I had no idea which way to go. Both directions looked the same, dark, infinite, suffocating. But then, faintly, I heard something, a different sound beneath the ticking, a heartbeat. I followed it. The corridor twisted and turned, narrowing until I had to squeeze through sections where the walls seemed to press in on me. The clocks covered every surface, their hands spinning faster and faster as I passed. The heartbeat grew louder, stronger, until it was pounding in my ears. And then I saw it. At the end of the corridor was a massive clock, its face as tall as a door. The cracks in its surface pulsed with the same yellow light, and the hands moved erratically, twitching and jerking like they were struggling to break free. The heartbeat was coming from inside it. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to warp around me. The floor rippled beneath my feet, and the walls twisted like they were alive. When I reached the clock, the whispering started again. This is the source. I didn't know what to do. I reached out, my hand trembling, and placed it against the cracked surface. The moment my skin touched the glass, the world exploded. I was no longer in the corridor. I was in a vast, empty space, the floor a seamless expanse of reflective black glass. Above me, the sky was a swirling vortex of dark clouds and fractured light. In the center of the space stood a figure. It wasn't like the shadows I'd seen before. This one was solid, massive, and cloaked in an aura of raw, unrelenting power. Its body was covered in jagged, shifting lines, like cracks spreading through porcelain. It turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw its eyes. They weren't eyes at all, but burning voids, endless and consuming. "You've come far," it said, its voice a deep rumble that shook the ground beneath me. "But you are too late." "Too late for what?" I shouted, gripping the clock like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. "To stop it," the figure said, stepping closer. "The enemy is awake." #### Part 8. The Awakening. The figure's presence was suffocating, its sheer size and power making the air around me feel heavy and alive. Its cracked form radiated heat, the kind you feel when standing too close to an open flame. "The enemy is awake?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "What the hell does that even mean? What is this?" It didn't answer right away. Instead, it reached out with one massive hand, its fingers jagged and fractured like shards of broken glass. The clocks in my hands began to shake violently, their ticking now an uncontrollable frenzy. "It's not a question of what," it said. "It's a question of when." The word struck something deep within me. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the figure didn't seem to care about my confusion. Its void-like eyes burned brighter as it continued, its voice reverberating through the infinite space around us. "You have broken the cycle, Paul. That is why I exist. That is why I was summoned." "What cycle?" I shouted. "What are you talking about? I didn't summon anything." The figure paused, tilting its head slightly, almost like it was amused by my outburst. "You didn't summon me," it said. It did, asterisk. The clocks, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, suddenly materialized in the space around us, forming a spinning ring that encased me like the orbit of a giant machine. The air pulsed with their rhythm, but it wasn't just ticking anymore. It was a heartbeat. It was my heartbeat. The realization hit me like a freight train. "These clocks," I whispered, staring at them as they swirled around me. "They're connected to me?" "Your life," the figure said, stepping closer. "Your choices. Your time. The cracks began with you." The phrase echoed in my head. "The cracks began with you." "What cracks?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Every decision you've ever questioned. Every moment you've wanted to undo. Every path you've tried to rewrite. You were warned. The loop was your salvation." "Salvation?" I spat. "You call this salvation? I'm stuck in a nightmare." The figure's burning voids flared, and its voice became thunderous. "You were given a chance to undo what should never have been. But you resisted. You ran. And now, the cracks have grown too wide to repair." The ring of clocks began to spin faster, their ticking blending into a deafening roar. I clutched the clock tighter, my knuckles white. "What's the enemy?" I demanded. "If it's not you, then what the hell is it?" The figure's fractured body trembled, and for the first time, I thought I saw fear. The enemy is time itself, it said, its voice quieter now. Unbound, uncontrolled. It cannot be stopped. It cannot be reasoned with. And you? Its burning void eyes locked onto me. You are the crack through which it escapes. The words left me reeling. I felt like I was falling, even though I was standing still. My grip on the clock loosened, and the whispering around me grew louder, more frantic. You're saying this is my fault? I shouted. That I caused all of this? I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any of this. And yet, here you are, the figure said. Your desire to rewrite your past has awakened what should have remained dormant. The cycle was meant to protect you, to protect everything. The clocks around us slowed, their spinning reduced to a crawl. Their light dimmed, casting long shadows across the reflective floor. The cycle is broken now, the figure said, and the enemy is free. Suddenly, the air split open with a sound like tearing metal. Behind the figure, a jagged rift appeared in the fabric of space, its edges glowing with an unearthly red light. The shadows around it pulsed and twisted, and from within the rift came a sound I'll never forget, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through my very soul. The figure turned toward the rift, its jagged form flickering like static. It's here, it said, its voice barely above a whisper. Before I could react, the rift exploded outward, and something stepped through. It wasn't like the shadow figures I'd seen before. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. Its body was a shifting mass of darkness, its edges constantly changing, as if it couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. Its eyes were swirling voids of red light, and its presence was overwhelming. Worse than the figure, worse than anything I'd encountered so far. This thing wasn't just watching me. It was devouring me with its gaze. The figure turned back to me, its jagged hand reaching out. You cannot stop it, it said, but you can still choose. Sacrifice yourself to repair the cracks, or let it consume all. My heart was pounding, the weight of the decision crashing down on me. What happens if I choose wrong? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure's void eyes burned brighter. You already know the answer. The air felt alive, vibrating with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The entity that had emerged from the rift, this thing that wasn't bound by shape or time, seemed to swallow the space around it. Every breath I took felt heavier, like the atmosphere itself was trying to crush me. And then there was the figure, standing tall despite the creature's oppressive presence. Its void-like eyes burned into mine as it repeated its ultimatum. Sacrifice yourself, or let it consume all. The words didn't just echo in the space around me. They settled deep in my chest, filling me with a cold, hollow dread. What happens if I sacrifice myself? I asked, my voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers and ticking clocks. The figure tilted its head, the cracks in its body glowing faintly. The cracks will seal, it said. The enemy will be forced back into the void. Time will reset. The loop will begin again. And if I don't? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. The figure turned its gaze toward the entity, which was now advancing slowly, its form shifting and contorting as it moved. Then the cracks will widen. The enemy will escape. It will devour not just you, but everything. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to run, but there was nowhere to go. No escape. This wasn't just about me anymore. I glanced down at the clock in my hands. Its cracked face pulsed faintly, in rhythm with the whispers. The hands weren't spinning anymore. They were frozen, pointing to 6:15. The weight of it felt different now, heavier, like it wasn't just a clock. It was a key, or a weapon. The entity let out a sound that wasn't quite a roar, more like a deep, guttural vibration that rippled through the space. Its void eyes locked onto me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in them. Recognition. It knew me, and it hated me. I turned back to the figure. Why me? I asked, my voice cracking. Why is this happening to me? The figure didn't hesitate. Because you tried to change what cannot be changed, it said. Your regrets created the first crack. Your choices made the others. You have always been the architect of this. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to deny it, to call it a lie, but deep down, I knew it was true. I had spent years wishing I could undo my mistakes, replaying moments in my head, imagining what life would be like if I'd done things differently. I'd wanted a second chance, and now, it seemed, I'd broken the world to get it. The entity surged forward, its form towering over me. The air around it warped and twisted, and the clocks began to spin wildly again, their ticking a frantic, deafening roar. The figure stepped between me and the entity, its fractured body glowing with a pale light. "The choice must be made now," it said. "There is no more time." I gripped the clock tighter, my mind racing. Sacrificing myself meant giving up everything. My life, my memories, my existence. The loop would reset, and I'd be trapped in Monday forever. But if I didn't, I looked at the entity, its void eyes burning with a terrible hunger. It was bigger now, its form expanding, stretching. The edges of the space around it began to crumble, pieces of reality dissolving into nothingness. If I didn't act, it wouldn't just take me. It would take everything. "I'll do it," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll seal the cracks." The figure nodded once, solemnly. "Then prepare yourself," it said. "This will not be painless." Before I could respond, the figure reached out and placed its jagged hand on my chest. The pain was instant and overwhelming, like my entire body was being ripped apart from the inside. The clock in my hands shattered, the pieces dissolving into light that seeped into my skin. The spinning clocks around us slowed, their ticking fading into silence. The entity roared, its form thrashing wildly as the cracks in reality began to seal themselves. The rift behind it shrank, pulling the creature back toward its depths. I could feel myself unraveling, my thoughts, my memories slipping away. And then, darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my bed. The alarm clock was on my nightstand, its face pristine, its hands pointing to 6:15 a.m. The room was quiet, too quiet. Something was wrong. The alarm clock didn't ring. I stared at it, heart pounding, waiting for the familiar, jarring sound that had become my constant companion. But it never came. The room was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you second-guess reality. I sat up slowly, glancing around the room. Everything looked normal. My dresser, my cluttered desk, the faint light streaming through the blinds. But it wasn't normal. I could feel it in the air, in my skin. Something had changed. I reached for the clock, half expecting it to shatter in my hands or whisper some cryptic message. But when I touched it, it was cold, lifeless. The ticking was gone. "Okay," I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. "This is good, right? The loop's broken. It's over." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I got up and went about my morning routine, desperate for something to anchor me. Coffee, shower, the same wrinkled button-up I'd been wearing for days. Outside, the city was awake, alive. Cars honked, people rushed down the sidewalks, and the air smelled faintly of exhaust and damp concrete. It all looked normal.